It was just after sunrise in Portland, Maine, when I realized how quiet my apartment had become. The sky outside my kitchen window held that pale blue color that only shows up for a few minutes before the day fully wakes. Harbor fog rolled in from the water and pressed itself against the glass, softening everything it touched. The outlines of nearby buildings blurred, and the usual sounds of gulls arguing over scraps and delivery trucks down the street came through like distant echoes instead of sharp noise. I sat at the small kitchen table that barely fit 2 chairs, my shoulders slightly hunched without realizing it. The chair across from me was empty, pushed in neatly, as if no one had ever sat there. A ceramic mug warmed my hands, though the coffee inside had gone untouched for several minutes. I lifted it now and then out of habit, took a sip, and felt nothing. The taste barely registered. I watched the steam rise in thin lines, curl once, and disappear into the air, and for a moment it felt like a perfect description of my life. Things that had once felt solid now faded before I could hold on to them. The apartment itself looked the same as it always had, but something about it felt hollow. The refrigerator hummed softly. The old radiator near the window clicked and settled as it worked against the morning chill. A single dish sat drying in the rack by the sink. Everything was orderly, quiet, and still, as if the space was holding its breath. Weeks earlier, this same room had been filled with movement and voices. Plans spoken aloud, small arguments that meant nothing, laughter that spilled over at odd moments. Now the silence felt heavier than any sound ever had. I traced my thumb along the rim of the mug and stared at a small chip in the glaze I had never bothered to replace. I remembered buying it at a local craft fair years ago, convincing myself it was worth the extra money because it felt sturdy, dependable. That word drifted through my thoughts and settled uncomfortably. Dependable was what I thought my life had been. Dependable was what I thought my future was going to look like. Sitting there now, wrapped in a worn sweater that smelled faintly of laundry soap, I understood how quickly that idea had slipped away. Outside, the city was waking up without any awareness of my private collapse. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed. A car engine turned over, coughed, then smoothed out. The muffled rhythm of someone jogging past my building reached my ears, steady and purposeful. Life was moving forward at its usual pace, and I felt oddly left behind, suspended in a moment that refused to end. I rested my elbows on the table and let my forehead drop into my hands. My hair fell forward, hiding my face, and for a second I stayed there, breathing slowly, counting each inhale and exhale. Weeks ago, my days had been filled with questions and noise. Phone calls I dreaded answering. Messages I read and reread, searching for meaning where there was none. Friends' voices offering comfort that I appreciated but could not absorb. Arguments played out in my head long after they were over. Now all of that had gone quiet, not because it was resolved, but because I was too tired to keep it alive. The quiet felt unfamiliar, almost wrong. I had grown used to chaos so quickly that calm now made me uneasy. It pressed on me in a way that made my chest tighten. Without the constant rush of emotion, there was room for thoughts I had been avoiding. Regret, doubt, the steady hum of self-blame. I straightened up and looked around again, as if the room might offer answers. Sunlight finally broke through the fog in thin streaks, catching dust particles in the air. I noticed details I had ignored for weeks. The faint crack in the wall near the doorway. A stack of unopened mail on the counter, neatly aligned but unresolved. A pair of shoes by the door that I had not worn in months. Each object felt like evidence of a life paused mid-sentence. I thought back to the mornings before everything changed. The rush of getting ready for work. Coffee gulped down while standing at the counter. Casual conversations that felt important simply because they were shared. I had taken those moments for granted, assuming they would always be there in some form. Sitting alone now, I realized how much of my sense of self had been tied to that shared rhythm. Without it, I felt unmoored. The clock on the microwave clicked from 6:59 to 7 o'clock with a soft beep that startled me. 7 in the morning. A time that once meant nothing more than the start of another ordinary day. Now it felt symbolic, like a line drawn between what had been and what came next. I wondered how many mornings I had slept through without noticing the light, the fog, the quiet. How many chances I had missed to pay attention. I stood and carried my mug to the sink, pouring the cold coffee down the drain. The dark liquid swirled away quickly, leaving behind a faint smell of bitterness. I rinsed the cup and set it upside down on a towel, then leaned against the counter with my hands flat on the surface. The cold lemonade grounded me. I closed my eyes and listened to the apartment again, the hum of electricity, the faint creak of the building settling. My own breathing, steady but shallow. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I allowed myself to admit a truth I had been circling for weeks. The noise had stopped because the life I was clinging to no longer existed. There was no argument left to replay, no explanation that would suddenly make things make sense. What remained was this quiet morning and the woman standing in it, unsure of who she was without the story she had been telling herself. I walked back to the table and sat down again, pulling my sweater tighter around me. The fog outside was lifting now, revealing the outlines of the harbor and the faint movement of boats beginning their day. Watching them, I felt a small shift inside my chest. It was not hope, not yet. It was simply awareness. An understanding that while my life had been shattered, it had also slowed enough for me to see where I stood. I did not make any promises to myself in that moment. I did not decide to be strong or brave or resilient. I simply sat there and stayed present. I let the quiet exist without rushing to fill it. I let the morning unfold as it would. In that stillness, I realized that this calm, heavy as it felt, was not an ending. It was the space left behind after something broke, waiting to be shaped into whatever came next. My name is Lauren Whitaker. I am 38 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been shaped by the steady rhythms of coastal New England. I was born in a small hospital outside Rockland, Maine, during a winter storm my mother still talks about when she wants to remind me that I arrived stubborn and determined. I grew up surrounded by salt air, pine trees, and the quiet understanding that you showed up, did your part, and did not make a fuss about it. My childhood home sat on a narrow road that curved toward the water. It was not large or impressive, but it was solid. My father worked for the town public works department, and my mother managed the front desk at a dental office for more than 20 years. They believed deeply in routine. Dinner was at 6. Homework was done at the kitchen table. Bills were paid on time, even if that meant skipping extras. There was comfort in knowing what came next, and I absorbed that lesson early. We were not a family that talked much about emotions. Love was expressed through actions. My father fixed things before they broke. My mother packed lunches with handwritten notes that said things like, "Have a good day" or "Drive safe." If something hurt, you handled it quietly and kept going. Crying was allowed, but not encouraged, and only behind closed doors. I learned to be self-sufficient before I learned how to ask for help. At school, I was the dependable one. Teachers trusted me. Friends leaned on me. I did my work on time and followed rules without much rebellion. I was not the loudest or the most ambitious, but I was consistent. Looking back, I realized how much I valued being seen as reliable. It felt like a form of safety. If people knew they could count on me, then I believed I would never be left behind. After high school, college felt like the natural next step, though I did not have a grand vision for my future. I attended a state university not far from home, majoring in business administration because it seemed practical. I worked part-time at a hardware store to help cover expenses and lived with 2 roommates who rotated in and out of my life without leaving much of a mark. I graduated on time, proud but quietly relieved, and moved back closer to the coast to begin what I assumed would be a stable adulthood. My career unfolded the way many sensible careers do. I started as an administrative assistant for a small construction company and worked my way into a project coordinator role over several years. I learned how to track budgets, manage timelines, and communicate between contractors and clients. I became good at anticipating problems before they escalated. My supervisors appreciated my attention to detail and my calm approach. The work paid the bills and offered benefits, which mattered to me more than passion ever did. Still, there was a part of me that noticed what the job did not give me. My imagination stayed largely untouched. My days were filled with schedules, spreadsheets, and emails written in careful, neutral language. I told myself that fulfillment came from stability, not excitement. That creativity was a luxury, something people with more security could afford. So I tucked that part of myself away and focused on building a life that made sense. Money has always been something I approached cautiously. I keep a spreadsheet of expenses and update it weekly. I pay my credit card balance in full every month. I drive a reliable car that I plan to keep until it no longer runs. These habits make me feel grounded. Independence to me means not needing to rely on anyone else to survive. It is a value I carry with pride, even when it weighs on me. Socially, my life has been quiet but steady. I have a small circle of friends, most of whom I met through work or mutual connections. We meet for coffee, take walks along the harbor, and check in on one another without overwhelming demands. I am not the friend who calls late at night in a crisis, but I am the one who shows up the next morning with food and a plan. People trust me, and that trust has become part of my identity. When it comes to relationships, I have always wanted something simple and safe. I was never drawn to drama or grand gestures. I wanted consistency, honesty, and mutual respect. A partnership where both people carried their weight and faced problems together without theatrics. I imagined shared routines, quiet evenings, and a sense of being on the same team. I believed that if he chose carefully and worked hard, that kind of life was attainable. I carried that belief into adulthood without questioning it much. I thought love was another form of reliability, something you earn through patience and effort. I ignored warning signs when they appeared, brushing them aside in favor of keeping things smooth. Conflict made me uncomfortable, so I avoided it whenever possible. I told myself that compromise was maturity, even when it meant staying silent. Looking back, I can see how much of my sense of self was built around being steady and agreeable. I took pride in being low maintenance, in not asking for too much. I measured my success by how little disruption I caused. That approach served me well in many ways, but it also left parts of me underdeveloped. I did not know how to advocate for myself when things felt off. I did not trust my instincts when they told me something needed to change. By the time I reached my late 30s, my life looked solid from the outside. I had a stable job, a comfortable apartment, and routines that made sense. I paid my own way and rarely needed help. People described me as grounded, practical, and dependable. Those words felt like compliments, even when they hinted at something missing. What I did not fully acknowledge was how much I longed for a future that felt emotionally secure as well as structurally sound. I wanted to feel chosen, not just useful. I wanted to believe that someone saw me not as the stable option, but as a person worth investing in fully. I carried that hope quietly, careful not to let it turn into expectation. In many ways, I thought I had done everything right. I followed the rules I was taught. I planned ahead. I worked hard and stayed loyal. I believed that if I built my life carefully enough, it would protect me from sudden loss. That belief shaped my decisions and kept me moving forward without questioning the foundation beneath me. Sitting with that understanding now, I see how deeply my upbringing, my work, and my values intertwined to form the woman I became. Someone steady, capable, and cautious. Someone who believed that a solid life was the same as a fulfilled one. I did not know then how fragile that assumption was, or how much strength it would take to redefine what solid really meant. The heartbreak came without warning, which is something people say often but rarely understand until it happens to them. There was no dramatic build-up, no single argument that hinted at what was coming. My life did not crack slowly. It split open in one ordinary moment, on a weekday evening that had started like any other. It was a Tuesday in early September. I remember because I had stayed late at work finishing a project timeline, determined to leave things tidy before heading home. The air outside carried the first hint of fall, that sharp, clean coolness that makes you walk a little faster. I unlocked my apartment door, expecting nothing more than a quiet night, maybe leftovers and a show playing softly in the background. Instead, I walked into a silence that felt tense, alert, as if the room itself knew something I did not. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Relationships go through phases, I reminded myself. People get distracted, stressed, distant. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and moved through the familiar motions of my evening. But something was off. There was a stiffness in the air, a sense of waiting. When I finally sat down, phone in hand, I saw the message that would change everything. The words themselves were not dramatic. They were careful, almost polite. A confession delivered with restraint, as if the truth might be less painful if it arrived calmly. I read it once, then again, my brain refusing to connect meaning to language. When it finally sank in, my chest tightened so quickly I had to stand up, as if my body needed more room to absorb the impact. Betrayal is a strange thing. It does not arrive as a single feeling, it comes in waves. Shock first, sharp and disorienting. Then disbelief, followed by a desperate urge to explain it away. I paced the living room, rereading the message, searching for misinterpretation. There had to be another explanation. There always is, I thought. But there was not. What hurt most in those first moments was not the loss itself, but the collapse of everything I thought I understood. The relationship I believed was built on honesty had been quietly unraveling without my knowledge. Conversations I remembered as sincere now felt questionable. Plans we had made together, discussed in detail, suddenly felt imaginary, like outlines drawn in sand before the tide came in. When we finally spoke face to face, the truth surfaced fully, and it landed like a physical blow. My ears rang as if I had been struck. My hands went numb. I remember sitting very still, afraid that if I moved, something inside me would break beyond repair. The room felt too bright, too exposed. I focused on small details just to stay present. The grain of the wooden table. A smudge on the wall I had meant to clean. The sound of my own breathing shallow and uneven. There were apologies, explanations, and reassurances that arrived too late to mean anything. Each word seemed to push the ground further out from under me. I realized how deeply I had trusted without question. How thoroughly I had built my sense of stability around the idea that what we shared was real and mutual. In that moment, I felt foolish for not seeing what was happening sooner, for believing that consistency equaled truth. The days that followed blurred together. I went to work and completed tasks on autopilot. I answered emails and attended meetings while my mind replayed conversations from the past year, examining them for signs I had missed. I found myself questioning my memory, my judgment, my instincts. Had I been naive, or had I simply wanted to believe so badly that I ignored reality? Loss arrived in layers. There was the obvious one, the absence of a person I had woven into my daily life. Then there was the quieter loss of routine. Shared meals, casual check-ins. The assumption that someone else knew where I was and cared enough to ask. Each absence revealed itself slowly, catching me off guard at unexpected moments. What surprised me most was how deeply the betrayal affected my sense of identity. I had always believed I was careful, perceptive, and grounded. Realizing how wrong I had been shook something fundamental. If I could be this mistaken about the person closest to me, what else had I misunderstood? That question followed me everywhere, settling into my thoughts like a low persistent. In the days that followed, my routines unraveled in ways that felt subtle at first, almost harmless, before they became impossible to ignore. I had always believed routine was something you either had or you did not. I did not realize how fragile it could be until mine slipped through my fingers without ceremony. The structure that once carried me through each day dissolved quietly, leaving behind long stretches of time I did not know how to fill. Mornings were the hardest. I would wake up to my alarm and lie still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of traffic outside and the distant sound of foghorns drifting in from the harbor. My body felt heavy, as if gravity had increased overnight. Some days I silenced the alarm and stayed where I was until the light shifted across the room, forcing me to acknowledge the passing of time. Other days I got up mechanically, moved through the apartment without intention, and wondered how I used to do all of this so easily. Meals became optional in a way they had never been before. I would realize late in the afternoon that I had not eaten since the night before, the hollow feeling in my stomach arriving long after it should have. When I did eat, it was whatever required the least effort, crackers straight from the box. A piece of toast eaten standing at the counter. Food felt like another task, something to be completed rather than enjoyed. The comfort I once found in cooking, in the quiet satisfaction of preparing something warm, disappeared. Laundry piled up in the corner of my bedroom, clean and dirty clothes mixing together until the distinction no longer mattered. I stepped over the heap each morning, telling myself I would deal with it later. The idea of folding shirts or matching socks felt strangely overwhelming, as if even small decisions demanded more energy than I possessed. I noticed these changes with a detached curiosity, like I was observing someone else's life from a distance. At work, I showed up on time and did what was expected of me, but my focus slipped constantly. I sat at my desk staring at spreadsheets I had built myself, numbers and formulas blurring together until they lost meaning. Emails took twice as long to write. Simple questions from coworkers felt intrusive, even when they were polite. I smiled when necessary, nodded during meetings, and hoped no one noticed how often my mind drifted away. Sometimes, I would catch myself rereading the same sentence over and over, unable to process it. Other times, I would realize several minutes had passed without any memory of what I had been doing. My thoughts returned again and again to the same place, replaying moments from the relationship as if they were evidence in a case I was trying to solve. I examined tone, timing, word choice. I searched for clues hidden in plain sight. The familiar streets of my neighborhood began to feel foreign, as if they belonged to a different version of me. I walked the same roads I always had, past the coffee shop on the corner, the small park near the water, the row of houses with neatly trimmed yards. Everything looked the same, yet it felt altered, like a set after the actors had left. I moved through it slowly, aware of how disconnected I felt from my surroundings. I noticed details I had never paid attention to before. A crack in the sidewalk shaped like a lightning bolt. The way the light hit the brick buildings in the late afternoon. The sound of someone laughing across the street, sharp and unexpected. Each observation landed without context, floating through my awareness without anchoring me to the moment. I felt present and absent at the same time. The sound of my phone vibrating became a source of tension. Each notification sent a small jolt through my body, tightening my chest and turning my thoughts sharply inward. Sometimes it was just a work email or a reminder I had forgotten to turn off. Other times it was a message from someone checking in, well-meaning and gentle. No matter who it was, my first reaction was always the same. Fear, followed closely by exhaustion. I began leaving my phone face down on the table, or in another room altogether, hoping to create distance from the constant possibility of interruption. Silence felt safer, even when it deepened the loneliness I was trying not to acknowledge. I told myself I needed time to think, though most of that time was spent circling the same questions without reaching any conclusions. I questioned my judgment relentlessly. How had I missed what was happening? Were there moments I ignored because they were inconvenient? Had I mistaken comfort for honesty? I replayed conversations in my head while brushing my teeth, while waiting at stoplights, while lying awake at night. Each memory shifted slightly with each replay, losing clarity instead of gaining it. There were moments when anger flared briefly hot and sharp, before fading into something duller and heavier. More often, I felt a quiet embarrassment that surprised me with its intensity. I prided myself on being perceptive, on reading situations carefully. Realizing how wrong I had been felt like a personal failure, one I did not know how to explain or correct. Sleep became uneven. Some nights I fell asleep quickly, my body giving in to exhaustion. Other nights I lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the building settle around me. My thoughts felt louder at night, unfiltered by the distractions of the day. I imagined alternative versions of events, conversations that went differently, moments where I spoke up instead of staying quiet. Weekends lost their shape. Without the structure of work, time stretched out uncomfortably. I canceled plans I had already made, offering vague explanations that felt easier than the truth. I stayed inside longer than usual, curtains half drawn, letting the outside world pass without me. The idea of being seen felt overwhelming, as if my internal disarray might show on my face. Despite everything, I kept functioning. Bills were paid. Tasks were completed. From the outside, my life probably looked unchanged. That contrast made the internal chaos feel even more isolating. I wondered how many people walked around every day carrying private storms, unnoticed and unresolved. As the days passed, I began to understand that this stage of loss was not dramatic or obvious. It was quiet erosion. Small pieces of my certainty wore away one by one. Confidence slipped into doubt. Familiarity turned into distance. The woman who once moved through her life with steady assurance now paused at every step, unsure of her footing. I did not yet know how to rebuild what had been shaken. I only knew that something fundamental had shifted, and that pretending otherwise took more energy than I could afford. The unraveling was not complete, but it was well underway, and I could feel it in every neglected chore, every unanswered message, every moment spent searching the past for answers that refused to surface. Weeks passed, not in a blur, but in a slow grinding way that made every day feel heavier than the last. Time did not soften anything. Instead, it stacked responsibilities on top of grief, until the weight became impossible to ignore. Life continued to ask things of me with the same expectations it always had, indifferent to the fact that something inside me was struggling to stay upright. Bills arrived with predictable precision. Envelopes slid through the mail slot and landed on the floor with soft thuds that fell louder than they should have. I gathered them once a week, stacking them neatly on the counter unopened at first. Electricity, rent, insurance, credit card statements. Each one reminded me that stability was not something you paused just because your heart was fractured. I opened them eventually, logged into my accounts, paid what was due. My hands moved confidently through the process even as my chest felt tight. I was still capable, that fact brought no comfort. At work, deadlines pressed forward without mercy. Projects moved from planning to execution. Emails multiplied. Meetings filled my calendar. I showed up each day dressed appropriately, hair pulled back, expression neutral. My coworkers asked how I was doing, their voices careful, and I offered short, practiced answers. I was fine, managing, hanging in there. The words came easily, detached from how I actually felt. Inside, the pressure was building. Every task took more effort than it should have. I stayed late not because I was behind, but because leaving felt like admitting I had nothing else to do. The office lights hummed overhead as the building emptied out, and I found a strange comfort in being one of the last people there. It gave me a reason to delay returning to my quiet apartment. Friends reached out consistently. Text messages arrived asking if I wanted to talk, to walk, to sit somewhere familiar and be distracted. They meant well, I knew that. I appreciated their persistence, even as I struggled to accept it. When I did agree to meet, the conversations felt strained. They listened patiently, nodding, offering reassurance, but I could not find the words to explain the emptiness I carried. How do you describe the absence of something you assumed would always exist? I spoke about surface details instead. I talked about being tired, about work stress, about needing time. I avoided the deeper truth because saying it out loud made it feel too real, too permanent. I worried that if I admitted how hollow I felt, it would confirm something was irreparably broken. So I kept things vague and changed the subject when emotions crept too close to the surface. Nights were the hardest. Sleep no longer came easily or stayed long. I would fall asleep from exhaustion, only to wake a few hours later with my mind already racing. The apartment was dark and still, the silence broken only by the old radiator near the window. It clicked, hissed, then fell quiet before starting again. The sound was oddly rhythmic, mechanical and persistent, marking the passing hours. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, tracing familiar cracks with my eyes. My thoughts drifted to places I tried to avoid during the day. Memories replayed themselves uninvited. Words spoken casually that now felt loaded. Moments I had interpreted as comfort that might have been indifference. I wondered how I had allowed my sense of security to become so intertwined with another person's choices. That question followed me relentlessly. How had I handed over so much of my stability without realizing it? I had always prided myself on independence, on standing on my own. Yet here I was, unraveling because someone else had not been honest. The contradiction unsettled me. It made me question the foundation of the life I had built so carefully. Some nights I sat up in bed and pressed my feet against the floor, grounding myself in the physical world. I reminded myself where I was. I focused on the cool air against my skin, the weight of the blanket, the familiar layout of the room. These small anchors helped, but only briefly. As soon as I lay back down, the questions returned. During the day, the tension manifested physically. My shoulders ached constantly. My jaw stayed clenched without my noticing. Headaches lingered behind my eyes. I caught myself holding my breath during moments of stress, as if preparing for impact. Even minor inconveniences felt overwhelming, triggering reactions that surprised me with their intensity. I began to notice how much effort it took to maintain the appearance of normalcy, smiling when appropriate, responding politely, showing up. It felt like performing a role I no longer understood. I worried that if I stopped trying, everything would fall apart completely. So I kept going, fueled more by habit than intention. Social invitations became harder to navigate. I wanted connection, but I feared it too. Being around couples made me acutely aware of what I had lost. Listening to others talk about future plans stirred a quiet resentment I did not like admitting to myself. I declined more often than I accepted, citing work or fatigue. Both were true, but neither told the full story. On weekends, the lack of structure amplified the tension. Without work to distract me, my thoughts filled every available space. I cleaned aimlessly, reorganized drawers that did not need attention, started tasks without finishing them. I turned on the television for background noise, not to watch anything in particular, just to avoid the silence. Despite all of this, there were moments when the pressure broke through in unexpected ways. I would feel tears well up while standing in line at the pharmacy or waiting at a red light. These moments embarrassed me, not because crying was wrong, but because they reminded me how fragile I felt. I swallowed those feelings quickly, storing them away for later, though later never seemed to arrive. The realization that hurt the most was understanding how much of my future I had imagined around someone else. Plans I had thought of as mutual now felt lopsided, incomplete, vacations not taken, conversations not had. A version of myself that existed only within that partnership. Losing those possibilities felt like mourning a life that never fully came to be. As the weeks dragged on, I began to sense that this tension could not remain contained forever. Something would have to change. Either I would collapse under the weight of maintaining control, or I would have to confront the reality I had been avoiding. That awareness hovered at the edge of my consciousness, unsettling but unavoidable. Lying awake one night, listening to the radiator cycle through its familiar noises, I admitted something I had resisted acknowledging. My life had not only hinged on someone else's choices. I had allowed it to. I had equated safety with certainty, partnership with protection. That belief had shaped my decisions more than I realized. The thought did not bring relief, but it brought clarity. Pressure, I understood, was not just something happening to me. It was revealing the fault lines already there. And while that realization scared me, it also hinted at the possibility that something different could exist on the other side of this strain. For now, though, the tension remained, unresolved, persistent. Each day added another layer to it, tightening the space around me. I did not yet know how to release it, only that I could feel it in my body, my thoughts, my restless nights. The weeks had passed, and instead of easing the pain, they had sharpened it, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable truth that surviving this would require more than endurance. The lowest moment arrived quietly, without warning or drama, which somehow made it harder to recognize while I was living it. There was no breaking news, no phone call, no sudden confrontation. It showed up disguised as an ordinary errand on an ordinary evening, the kind of task I had completed hundreds of times without thought. It was late autumn, the sky already dark by the time I pulled into the grocery store parking lot after work. A thin mist hung in the air, clinging to the pavement and reflecting the glow of overhead lights. I sat in my car for a few extra minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the automatic doors sliding open and closed as people moved in and out. I told myself I was just tired, that I would feel better once I got inside and crossed the task off my list. The store smelled like produce and disinfectant, a combination that felt oddly sharp that evening. The hum of refrigeration units blended with distant music playing softly over the speakers. I grabbed a cart and began moving through the aisles slowly, aware of how heavy my body felt, as if each step required deliberate effort. My list was short: milk, bread, soup, nothing complicated, nothing emotional. At first, everything seemed manageable. I selected produce, checking it carefully out of habit, even though I no longer cared much about what I ate. I passed other shoppers without really seeing them. A couple arguing quietly over cereal brands. A tired-looking parent negotiating with a restless child. A man standing alone in the frozen food section, staring into an open freezer as if waiting for guidance. I recognized myself in him and looked away. When I reached the aisle with canned goods, something shifted. I stopped in front of the shelves lined with nearly identical options: tomato soup, chicken noodle, vegetable, low sodium, organic, store brand, name brand. I stood there longer than necessary, reading labels I had read countless times before. My mind refused to settle on a choice. Each option felt equally unimportant and impossibly significant at the same time. My hand hovered near the shelf, then dropped back to the cart handle. I leaned forward slightly, resting my weight against it, feeling the cold metal press into my palms. My chest tightened, and suddenly my breathing felt shallow. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, their brightness unforgiving. I became acutely aware of how exposed I felt, standing there frozen in place over something so trivial. Tears rose quickly, catching me off guard. I blinked hard, swallowing, focusing on the floor tiles to keep them from spilling over. The idea that I could not choose a can of soup felt humiliating. I had managed budgets, coordinated projects, navigated crises at work, yet here I was, undone by a grocery aisle. The contrast felt cruel. I stayed there longer than I should have, pretending to read labels while my thoughts unraveled. It was not about soup. I knew that even as the moment overtook me. It was about the accumulation of weeks spent waiting for something to change on its own, waiting for understanding to arrive, waiting for the pain to organize itself into something manageable, waiting for someone else to explain what had happened in a way that would make it hurt less. As I leaned on the cart, breathing slowly, a realization settled in with uncomfortable clarity. I had been waiting for clarity to arrive instead of creating it. I had been standing still, hoping that time alone would hand me answers, that healing would show up fully formed if I just endured long enough. That expectation had kept me passive, suspended between what was and what might be. The understanding landed hard. It stung in a way that felt personal, like a truth I had been avoiding because it demanded something from me. Clarity was not something that happened to you. It was something you built, piece by piece, through decisions and honesty and effort. I had spent weeks circling my pain without stepping into it fully, afraid of what action might reveal. The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, silent and quick. I turned my head slightly, letting my hair fall forward to hide my face. I hoped no one was paying attention. No one was. The world continued around me, indifferent and busy, which was both painful and oddly reassuring. This moment belonged to me alone. I wiped my cheeks with the back of my hand and took a deeper breath. My body shook slightly, releasing tension I had been carrying without realizing it. I did not feel better, not exactly, but I felt present in a way I had not in weeks. The fog that had surrounded my thoughts thinned just enough for me to see where I was standing. I straightened up and placed a can of soup into the cart without much thought. The choice itself did not matter. What mattered was the act of choosing. Of moving forward, however small the step. I pushed the cart down the aisle, my legs unsteady but functioning, my mind quieter than it had been moments before. As I continued shopping, I noticed my surroundings again, the squeak of cart wheels, the clink of glass jars being stocked, the way the air felt cooler near the freezers. These details grounded me in the present, pulling me out of the endless replay of the past. I was here, I was moving, I was still capable of action. At the checkout, I unloaded my items slowly, placing them on the conveyor belt one by one. The cashier greeted me with practiced cheerfulness, and I returned a small tired smile. The interaction was brief and unremarkable, yet it felt significant simply because I was participating in it fully. When I paid and gathered my bags, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve settle over me. Walking back to my car, the cool air hit my face, and I welcomed it. I paused before unlocking the door, letting myself stand there for a moment longer. I thought about how easily my life had narrowed over the past weeks, shrinking down to survival and endurance. I thought about how much energy I had spent waiting instead of acting, hoping instead of deciding. That night did not fix anything. The pain did not disappear. The future did not suddenly look clear or inviting. But something fundamental shifted. I understood that waiting for clarity was another way of avoiding responsibility for my own healing. That realization hurt, because it meant the work ahead belonged to me. No one else could do it on my behalf. Driving home, the streets felt less foreign than they had in weeks. The familiar landmarks passed by, unchanged, steady. I noticed how my hands felt on the steering wheel, how my breathing had slowed. The world had not softened, but I had found a way to stand inside it again. Back in my apartment, I put the groceries away and turned on a light I usually left off. The room looked the same, but my relationship to it felt slightly different. I was no longer just enduring the space. I was occupying it, claiming it. I sat down at the kitchen table and rested my hands flat on the surface, feeling its solidity beneath my palms. That evening marked the lowest point not because it was dramatic, but because it stripped away my illusions. It forced me to see how passive I had become in my own life. It showed me that healing would not arrive fully formed, that strength would not appear on its own. It would be built slowly, through choices that felt uncomfortable and honest. The understanding grounded me, even as it hurt. It planted my feet back on the floor of my own life. From that place, painful and clear-eyed, I knew I could no longer wait for someone else's actions or explanations to determine my sense of stability. The next steps were still unclear, but for the first time in weeks, they felt possible. The shift began quietly, unexpectedly, in a way that made it feel almost ordinary at first. I had made the decision to meet my Aunt Denise almost on a whim. She had called a few days prior, her voice calm but insistent, offering what she described as a little perspective, nothing more. I hesitated at first, but something inside me, weary of being trapped in my own head, finally said yes. That evening, I drove along the familiar streets of Portland toward the waterfront, past the buildings softened by the amber glow of streetlights, and the faint, briny scent of the harbor drifting in the air. The diner was small and unassuming, tucked between a bookstore and a boutique that had long since changed ownership. Its windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and a neon sign hummed softly, "Joe's Breakfast and Coffee." I parked in the lot behind the building, my hands gripping the steering wheel longer than necessary before stepping out. My heart thumped not from anticipation of seeing Denise but from the nervous energy of facing myself in the reflection of someone else's eyes. I pushed open the glass door, the familiar bell announcing my arrival, and was immediately enveloped by the warmth of the diner. The scent of bacon sizzling on the grill mixed with the aroma of coffee strong, dark, comforting. There were only a few patrons, a man in a business suit scrolling through his phone, a couple quietly sharing a meal in the corner booth, and a waitress refilling a mug for someone at the counter. Everything was ordinary, domestic, familiar. And yet, to me, it felt momentous. Denise was already seated in our usual booth by the window, a spot that allowed her to watch the harbor lights reflect on the water beyond. She looked up when I arrived, her expression calm, welcoming, but not questioning. She had a way of making you feel safe enough to speak without being forced to explain yourself. I slid into the seat across from her, feeling the weight of weeks pressing into my shoulders. The table between us carried the remnants of a previous diner ritual, a small glass of water, a sugar bowl, and a menu that had seen too many years. We ordered our food in silence, the server nodding politely before retreating. I chose scrambled eggs and toast. Denise went for a simple omelette with vegetables. As we waited, I stared out the window, watching the harbor shimmer under the streetlights, the water moving quietly, endlessly. The motion was soothing in its predictability, a subtle reminder that life, like the tides, would continue to move even when I felt frozen in place. Denise didn't speak first. She didn't prod or fill the silence with platitudes, she simply listened. And in that silence I began to talk hesitantly at first, each word a careful excavation of feelings I had been burying for weeks. I told her about the betrayal, about the relationship that had once felt like solid ground and now left me disoriented. I spoke about the day spent wandering through my apartment, staring at walls, and the nights when sleep eluded me entirely. I described the grocery store incident, my inability to make simple decisions, the crushing weight of my own indecision. She nodded, but never interrupted, never offered immediate solutions. Her eyes, calm and steady, held mine with quiet understanding. For the first time in weeks I felt seen. Truly seen, not as someone who needed fixing, but as someone navigating an incredibly human moment. It was a relief, the kind that sinks into your bones and allows your body to exhale after holding its breath for far too long. When I paused, unsure of what to say next, she leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table. "Lauren," she said softly, "strength is not loud or dramatic. It doesn't always show up with fireworks or speeches. Most of the time, it shows up quietly when you choose yourself without apology." Her words struck me with the force of clarity. I realized I had been waiting for dramatic gestures, for epiphanies that would drop like lightning, for someone else to tell me that I was okay. I had been looking outside myself for validation, for courage that had always been my own to claim. Her words reframed everything. Strength was not about endurance alone. It was about action. It was about choosing, deciding, moving, even when you were afraid or uncertain. I sat back, letting the idea settle into me. I thought about all the mornings I had spent staring at the ceiling, all the afternoons wandering the streets, all the nights lying awake listening to the radiator click. All of that time, I had been waiting for clarity to arrive, for healing to find me. I hadn't realized that healing would only come when I actively reached for it. That revelation was uncomfortable, almost painful, but it was also grounding. Denise continued, her voice gentle but firm. "It's easy to let life feel like it's happening to you. But you have to step in and take it back, piece by piece. You don't have to move fast. You don't have to be perfect. Just start with what you can control." Her advice was practical in a way that felt approachable. She wasn't telling me to be brave in grand gestures. She was telling me to start small, to take responsibility for my own choices and boundaries. She was reminding me that the foundation for the rest of my life didn't have to be rebuilt in a single day. It could be constructed brick by brick, decision by decision. The food arrived, eggs fluffy and golden, toast lightly buttered, and I picked at it almost mechanically, though the act of eating felt grounding. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the conversation having shifted. The warmth of the diner, the faint hum of the grill in the background, and the occasional clatter of dishes made the space feel protective, almost intimate. I realized I hadn't felt safe enough to just be myself for weeks, and here, across from my aunt, I could. After a while, I found myself asking questions I hadn't dared to think before. How do you start over without losing yourself? How do you rebuild trust with your own judgment? Denise answered in her own quiet, steady way, giving advice that felt like a roadmap without overwhelming me with instructions. She spoke of routines, small acts of self-respect, and the importance of boundaries not as punishments, but as tools for self-preservation. By the time we finished our meal, the evening had deepened. The harbor outside glimmered with reflections of lights on the water, shifting slowly with each ripple. I felt a sense of possibility I hadn't known in weeks. It was not hope fully formed, not yet. It was the first flicker of awareness that I could make decisions for myself, that I could take steps, however small, to reclaim my life. When we left the diner, Denise walked with me to my car. The night air was brisk, carrying the faint tang of salt and the distant sound of water lapping against the docks. I felt lighter, my shoulders less tense, though the weight of the weeks had not disappeared entirely. I knew the work ahead would be difficult, that it would require patience, persistence, and courage I wasn't sure I fully possessed yet. I hugged her at the car, tight and long, and whispered a quiet thank you. She held me steady, not judging, not lecturing, simply holding a space where I could feel supported and capable at the same time. When I finally released her, I knew something had shifted inside me. Driving home, I replayed the conversation in my mind, the quiet moments, the practical advice, the reminder that strength could be subtle and persistent rather than loud or dramatic. For the first time in weeks, I felt a faint but steady clarity. The decisions I had been avoiding were no longer abstract concepts. They were within my reach. I did not have to wait for life to hand me direction or for someone else to validate my choices. I could act. I could choose. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the outlines of buildings and streetlights I had walked past without noticing for so long. I carried that clarity with me as I stepped inside. I unpacked my bag slowly, noticing the familiar details of my apartment in a new way, the texture of the countertop under my hands, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the muted colors of the walls warmed by lamplight. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a subtle shift in my chest. The despair and confusion that had dominated my weeks were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. I had a sense of direction, a small but steady understanding that I could move forward. The turning point was not a sudden cure, not a dramatic epiphany. It was a quiet decision to begin, a gentle recognition that strength was available to me if I chose it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed that I could. That I would. That my life was mine to shape, one deliberate choice at a time. The days after that diner conversation felt different, though not dramatically so. There was no sudden rush of courage, no overnight transformation. Instead, a quiet insistence took root inside me, a subtle voice that said, "You can begin again, even here, even now." I realized growth wasn't something that arrived fully formed. It was incremental, shaped by small, deliberate actions that demanded attention and courage in equal measure. I started with the mornings. Waking up had been a struggle for weeks, but I made myself open the curtains to let in the soft light of Portland's early autumn sun. The sky was pale blue, almost washed with pink along the edges, the kind of morning that always seemed to promise possibility even when nothing else did. I laced up my sneakers and stepped out onto the quiet streets, my breath visible in the crisp air. The harbor became my first anchor. Its familiarity offered comfort without pressure. I walked along the boardwalk, past boats tied gently to the docks, their masts leaning like tall, patient sentinels. The water glimmered under the morning sun, soft ripples reflecting the skyline of buildings across the way. Gulls called out to each other, a sound I had once taken for granted, now an almost musical reassurance of continuity. With each step, my body remembered what it was like to move freely, to exist in a space that was mine alone. These walks were quiet, meditative. I allowed myself to notice the small things I had overlooked in my previous haze, the way sunlight caught the edges of waves, the smell of salt and seaweed in the air, the rhythmic creak of dockboards underfoot. I greeted familiar faces, fishermen unloading crates, early joggers passing me with a nod, and let the ordinary human interactions remind me that I was still part of a world beyond my grief. The harbor walks weren't just physical, they were symbolic. Each morning, I took steps not just along the boardwalk, but toward reclaiming a sense of agency over my own life. I realized that movement, however simple, was a choice. And choices, even small ones, mattered. At work, the changes were subtler but just as significant. I began asserting boundaries in ways I had avoided before. I declined meetings that were unnecessary for my role, politely but firmly. I said no to extra projects that would stretch me too thin. At first, the words felt foreign on my tongue, almost rebellious. I worried that people would see me as difficult or disengaged. But each time I set a boundary, I felt a small, solid sense of reclamation. My energy became mine to protect, and I discovered a quiet satisfaction in honoring that. Socially, I learned the importance of saying no as well. Invitations I would have once accepted out of habit or guilt were now carefully considered. Coffee with friends who drained my energy was postponed. Brunches that left me anxious were declined. Instead, I focused on the relationships that nourished me, people who could meet me where I was without judgment. It was not about isolation. It was about preservation. Each refusal was a conscious act of self-respect, a declaration that my time and mental space mattered. Perhaps the most transformative step came from revisiting a dream I had shelved long ago. Writing had always been my secret refuge, a place where imagination and reflection could meet in a quiet conversation. I had postponed signing up for a local community writing class for years, citing work, fatigue, or a lack of confidence. Now, something inside me insisted, start now. The first class felt daunting. I walked into a small, sunlit room filled with other students, notebooks open, pens poised. My heart raced, and my hands felt awkward holding the pen. I worried my words would sound trivial or cliché. But as the session began, led by a patient instructor who encouraged free expression without judgment, I realized something profound. My voice mattered. My stories, my reflections, my perspective, all of it belonged. I wrote sentences I thought I would never write aloud. I shared paragraphs I had once believed too personal to exist outside my journal. Each word, each sentence became a small act of courage, a tiny reclaiming of my confidence and self-trust. Progress was slow. Some days I moved forward in measurable ways. Other days, I felt stuck in the same patterns of self-doubt. I missed deadlines at the class, skipped walks, and wavered when asserting boundaries. But I no longer berated myself for imperfection. Instead, I recognized that effort, not perfection, defined growth. Each choice, even when faltering, became a brick in the foundation I was rebuilding beneath me. I began journaling in the evenings as well, a new ritual alongside the harbor walks. I wrote about my fears, my small victories, my mistakes, and my lingering sadness. Seeing my thoughts on paper helped me recognize patterns, understand emotions, and articulate desires I had not fully acknowledged. Each page was a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I could nurture rather than judge. Exercise became another quiet ally. I joined a local yoga studio, something I had resisted for years, worried I would be too inflexible or uncoordinated. The first sessions left me sore and awkward, but they also left me grounded. Yoga taught me to inhabit my body fully, to focus on breath and movement, to acknowledge limitations without shame. With each session, I felt my muscles strengthen, yes, but also a sense of internal steadiness I had not realized I was missing. I also revisited old routines that had once brought me joy, but were easy to abandon during grief. I made coffee at home with care, rather than gulping it down on autopilot. I took the time to read books I had shelved months ago. I cooked meals slowly, noticing the textures and smells, the ritual of transforming raw ingredients into nourishment. Each of these small, intentional actions reminded me that life could be enjoyable again, even if it was different than I had imagined. One afternoon, while walking along the harbor, I paused on the edge of the dock and looked at the boats bobbing gently in the water. The sun reflected in shifting patterns across the waves, and a faint wind tousled my hair. I realized that, for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of ownership over my own life. The decisions I had made, some small, some significant, had begun to reshape me. I had set boundaries, I had pursued interests, I had moved my body. I had reclaimed moments of joy, however fleeting. And in that reclamation, I discovered that trust in myself could grow again, one choice at a time. Even setbacks no longer crushed me completely. Missed walks, skipped writing sessions, moments of doubt, they were no longer indicators of failure, but reminders that growth was uneven. I could falter and still continue. I could be imperfect and still move forward. That understanding, more than any dramatic gesture, became my new anchor. By the end of the weeks that followed, I recognized a subtle but undeniable transformation. My mornings felt lighter, my steps surer. I laughed more easily even in small bursts. I approached work with clarity and respect for my own limits. I engaged in social situations selectively but meaningfully. I wrote, I moved, I chose. Progress was not linear, but it was real, and it was mine. Each deliberate choice, each act of self-care, each embrace of discomfort reinforced a trust I had thought I had lost. The woman who had wandered through grocery aisles, unable to make a simple decision, now faced her days with intention. I was learning that rebuilding life after heartbreak was not about rushing to joy or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about honoring the process, however slow, and reclaiming agency in ways both small and meaningful. By the time the first snow began to dust Portland's streets, I noticed how far I had come without fully realizing it. The harbor walks had become a routine, the writing class a source of pride, boundaries at work a non-negotiable practice. My life was quieter than it had been, but steadier. I had begun to trust myself again. I had begun to inhabit my own world fully. And though the road ahead was still long, I understood for the first time that I was capable of walking it, step by careful step, choice by deliberate choice. By the time spring settled over Portland, Maine, the city itself seemed to reflect the subtle changes within me. The early snow had melted, leaving wet pavement that glistened under soft sunlight. Trees along the streets began to bud, delicate green leaves pushing through bare branches. Even the air smelled different, warmer, carrying hints of salt from the harbor mingled with the faint fragrance of spring blooms. I noticed all of it in a way I hadn't in months, and I realized that noticing life again was a quiet, profound marker of change. My mornings had grown steady. I no longer fought the urge to get out of bed. Instead, I rose with intention. Breakfast became a ritual I savored, rather than a perfunctory task. I brewed coffee slowly, letting the rich aroma fill the kitchen. I sat by the window, drinking from my favorite mug, and watched seagulls skim over the water. There were no grand declarations of happiness, no sudden leaps of triumph. Just calm, steady, familiarity with myself that no longer felt fragile. That comfort in my own company, once a rare luxury, had become routine, and it was deeply satisfying. At work, the shift was tangible. Months of quiet effort and reflection had given me clarity about my own skills and contributions. I approached my manager one afternoon, a little nervous but firm in my reasoning, and asked for responsibilities that better matched my strengths and interests. To my relief, she responded positively, offering projects that challenged me in new ways without overwhelming me. I began leading small initiatives, coordinating teams, and presenting strategies I had developed. There was a subtle confidence in these interactions, a quiet authority I had not felt in months, and it thrilled me to recognize that my professional life could be both meaningful and manageable. Colleagues began noticing the difference, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle ease with which I handled challenges and communicated expectations. Meetings felt less like performances I was desperately trying to survive and more like opportunities to contribute, to problem solve, to lead. For the first time in a long while, I looked forward to work not because it distracted me from pain, but because it offered a space where I felt competent, capable, and respected. My social life too had begun to bloom in its own time. I didn't rush into friendships or force connections. Instead, I allowed relationships to form naturally, guided by mutual interest and genuine care rather than obligation. There was Emma, a coworker who shared my love of writing and had a quiet, mischievous sense of humor. We began meeting for coffee once a week, discussing everything from books to work challenges to the city's best bakeries. There was also Marisol, a neighbor I had occasionally passed in the hallway, but had never spoken to. One afternoon, a casual conversation about the weather turned into a long walk along the harbor, talking about everything from childhood memories to life goals. These new connections were not dramatic or life-altering in the way movies portray them. They were gentle, comforting, and affirming. Romance remained entirely off the table, and I was grateful for it. I had no interest in distraction or the illusion of moving on. I had learned through months of quiet struggle that filling space with someone else's presence before I was ready would have been a betrayal of the work I had done on myself. Instead, I relished solitude, not loneliness, but the fullness of being alone without feeling empty. I spent evenings reading on my balcony, walking along the harbor, or attending my writing class. I noticed the subtle joys of my own company, small triumphs I had once overlooked. Finishing a chapter one had labored over, savoring a perfectly brewed cup of coffee, feeling the sun warm my shoulders during a morning walk. Spring weekends became a time for exploration rather than avoidance. I began venturing further along the coastline, discovering small beaches and hidden coves that had been invisible to me when my thoughts were consumed with loss. I would pack a thermos of tea and a notebook, find a quiet spot by the water, and write about what I noticed, the sound of waves against rocks, the cries of gulls, the wind pulling at my hair. These excursions weren't grand adventures. They were moments of presence, each one reminding me that life was still full of texture and beauty, and that I could inhabit it fully. Even the apartment felt different. The space I had once traversed in a fog of grief now felt alive and familiar. I kept it tidy, not out of obligation, but because I took pride in creating a space where I could feel at ease. Fresh flowers often sat on the kitchen counter. Books I had been reading leaned in stacks across the living room. The sunlight streaming through the windows revealed corners I had neglected to notice for months. The apartment no longer felt like a holding place for sadness but a sanctuary I had shaped with intention. I also noticed a new patience with myself. Setbacks still occurred, as they always would. A day when motivation failed, a writing assignment left incomplete, a moment of lingering doubt. But I no longer met these moments with frustration or self-criticism. Instead, I acknowledged them, accepted them as part of the process, and moved forward. Progress, I realized, was not linear. It was uneven, jagged, sometimes slow, but it was real. Each small action reinforced my trust in myself, a trust I had nearly lost during the months of heartbreak. By mid-April, I felt the most important change of all, a sense of inner stability. The emotional turbulence that had once dominated my days had subsided. I no longer measured my worth by someone else's presence or absence. I could feel sadness without being consumed by it. I could remember the pain without reliving it. And I could envision the future without fear, even if that vision remained fluid and undefined. One morning, I took my usual walk along the harbor and paused at the edge of the boardwalk, looking out at the boats bobbing gently in the sunlight. The water reflected the sky in shifting patterns of gold and blue, and for the first time in months, I felt a profound sense of calm. I realized that peace had become my goal, not distraction or validation. I no longer needed constant movement to escape the ache of loss. I could sit, breathe, and simply exist in the world I had carefully begun to rebuild. That evening, I met Emma for coffee. We laughed freely over small mishaps in our lives, talked about books we loved, and shared plans for upcoming writing assignments. When I returned home, I spent time with my journal, reflecting on the past months. I wrote about my routines, my boundaries, my harbor walks, and the writing class that had reminded me that my voice mattered. I acknowledged the moments of struggle and the choices that had brought me here. For the first time, reflection felt like affirmation rather than pain. I realized then that success was not measured by grand accomplishments or dramatic milestones. It was measured by consistency, by the intentional care I gave to myself, by the boundaries I honored, by the choices I made day after day. It was in waking up and meeting the morning sun without dread, in attending a class that nurtured my creativity, in walking the harbor and noticing the smallest details, in declining what did not serve me. Success was quiet, steady, and profoundly personal. By spring, I had regained a rhythm that was both comforting and empowering. My apartment, my work, my friendships, and my own company were in balance. I was not the same person I had been before heartbreak, and I no longer wanted to be. I had discovered that resilience was not a forceful declaration, but a patient reconstruction of self. I had learned that joy could coexist with sorrow, that solitude could be rich with life, and that trust in oneself was the foundation upon which all else rested. And as the days grew warmer, the harbor sparkled under the sun, and the city hummed with the return of life and possibility. I understood something essential. Peace, intentionally cultivated and patiently nurtured, was its own form of triumph. It was quiet, it was subtle, and for the first time in a long time, it was entirely mine. Today, when I look out at the water, I no longer see only the reflection of the sky or the boats bobbing gently along the harbor. I see the reflection of a life I reclaimed, one piece at a time, through decisions both small and deliberate. The sunlight glints off the surface of the waves in shifting patterns of gold and blue, and the gentle rhythm of water lapping against the docks carries a quiet reassurance I can feel in my chest. The harbor that once felt like a backdrop to grief now feels like a witness to resilience. I sit on the weathered wooden bench along the boardwalk, my journal resting on my lap, pen poised but often unused. I watch the gulls wheel overhead, their cries echoing faintly across the water, and I notice how easy it is to breathe here, how unforced my presence feels. Months ago, walking these same streets, I have felt alienated from the world around me. Each wave, each distant laugh, each passing neighbor had reminded me that I was missing a part of myself I didn't know how to reclaim. Now, the same environment offers comfort instead of discomfort. It feels steady, unshakable, as if the city itself has quietly validated the work I've done. Heartbreak did not end my story. That lesson is something I carry with me every day. Losing someone I had trusted, someone whose absence had once seemed catastrophic, forced me to confront truths I might otherwise have avoided. I had been waiting for clarity to arrive, waiting for someone else's actions to validate my worth. Instead, I was compelled to listen to my own voice, to navigate the murky terrain of my feelings, and to act in ways that honored my values. That process was painful, exhausting, and often lonely, but it was also transformative. I reflect on the months since that turning point at the diner with my Aunt Denise. Her words, "Strength is quiet, strength is choosing yourself without apology," echo through my mind. I understand now that those words were not just advice. They were a roadmap for how to live with integrity and patience, a guide for rebuilding a self I had nearly lost. The morning walks along the harbor, the writing class I had postponed for years, the conscious choices to set boundaries and preserve my energy, all of those actions formed a scaffold upon which my life could rest again. Each choice was a conversation with myself, a reaffirmation that I mattered, that my needs mattered, and that my story was not defined by loss alone. Healing did not arrive in a dramatic, cinematic moment. There were no fireworks, no sudden epiphany. There were mornings I woke up and felt the familiar tightness in my chest, nights I still lay awake listening to the radiator click and hiss, and afternoons when a minor disappointment sent waves of doubt through me. But over time, I learned to recognize these moments not as failures, but as markers of a process in motion. Healing, I realized, is cumulative. It is a quiet, persistent unfolding that begins when you choose to step forward, even when the path is unclear. I have become attuned to the subtle markers of growth. I notice the calm with which I handle decisions now, from mundane tasks like grocery shopping to more complex choices at work and in friendships. I notice the patience I afford myself when I stumble, the willingness to begin again without recrimination. I notice the clarity that has returned to my thoughts, a clarity that allows me to prioritize what matters, to let go of what no longer serves me, and to embrace what enriches my life. These small recognitions feel monumental in the quiet way they unfold. I think about the person I was at my lowest points, the one standing frozen in grocery aisles, unable to choose, who felt adrift in her own life. That person is still part of me, but she no longer dictates my story. I have reclaimed my agency, built step by step, through months of intentional effort. I have learned that strength is not a state of being, but a practice, a series of choices repeated consistently. I have learned that resilience is not about ignoring grief, but about integrating it, allowing it to coexist with hope and self-respect. The harbor itself has become a metaphor for this process. Just as the water is always in motion, shifting with tides and currents yet never disappearing entirely, the waves remind me that continuity exists even when change is abrupt, that endings are not erasure but transformation. And I am struck by the thought that life too can be guided gently by subtle forces rather than brute effort alone. Sometimes, all it takes is trusting the current and adjusting the rudder with intention. I have learned to embrace solitude without fear. I enjoy my own company in ways I could not before. Reading on the balcony, journaling my thoughts, wandering the harbor, these are not acts of avoidance but of presence. I no longer seek distraction as a balm for discomfort. Peace itself, quiet and steady, has become an achievement worth celebrating. I can sit with myself, reflect, observe, and participate in life without needing validation from anyone else. That ability, which I once took for granted before heartbreak, now feels like a profound gift. Friendships too have deepened with this newfound clarity. Connections that form naturally, free from expectation or obligation, have become meaningful anchors. Emma, Marisol, and others in my life remind me that companionship is valuable when chosen intentionally, when it uplifts rather than depletes. I have learned to engage authentically, to speak and listen with honesty, and to let relationships evolve at their own pace. There is no rush, no pressure, just the steady recognition that connection is a shared journey rather than a solution to loneliness. I do not rush into romance. That chapter of my life remains on pause, not because I am fearful or bitter, but because I have learned the value of waiting until I am whole enough to enter it fully. I understand that my story is mine first, and any future partnership will complement, not define the life I have painstakingly rebuilt. This restraint feels empowering. It is a testament to how far I have come, to the trust I have rebuilt in myself, and to the wisdom gained from prior pain. As I sit here now, the harbor stretching wide before me, I can name the lessons this journey has given me. That grief is not weakness, that patience is strength, that choice is empowerment, and that trust in oneself is irreplaceable. I understand that heartbreak, for all its pain, clarified my life rather than ended it. It forced me to listen, to act, to honor my own needs, and to discover resilience I did not know I possessed. I am still careful, still deliberate, and still thoughtful about who and what I allow into my life. I am still hopeful, though that hope is quieter, less frantic than it once was. And most importantly, I am grounded, rooted in the knowledge that my life, my choices, and my joy belong to me. Healing did not arrive all at once, and it did not erase the past, but it stayed, growing slowly and persistently, becoming the foundation on which I now stand. The sun lowers toward the horizon, painting the water with streaks of pink and gold. I breathe deeply, letting the cool harbor air fill my lungs, feeling the subtle pulse of life around me. For the first time in a long time, I feel entirely present, entirely myself, and entirely at peace. My story is ongoing, shaped by the choices I make each day, but it is no longer defined by loss. Heartbreak was a chapter, not the conclusion, and what remains is the quiet, enduring power of a woman who has finally learned to stand firmly in her own truth.